Hi, I'm Peter. I'm the owner and pit master of Pitt County Barbecue. I grew up in Alberta, and I've been lucky to experience what this great province has to offer. Join me as I talk to farmers, friends, and colleagues. I want to share with you what I love about food and what I enjoy about the great people who live here. Welcome to Friends of the Pit. So today we are here with Will from Meuwlys, and one of the more important reasons why I wanted to do an episode with you is to showcase what you're doing in the local Edmonton community, especially when it comes to old world preservation techniques for meat and cheese and other fermentations. That being said, how would you introduce Meuwlys to people who don't know it?
That's a good question. I mean, normally I kind of just sum it up with like, we're bringing in whole animals to produce old world style cured meat products, like you just said, with the main point being approachability and really the educational part that is missing in a lot of these types of products, that people lost touch with how they're made, or feel a little bit worried about, like, oh, I left my yogurt on the counter, so now it's garbage. Like, well, actually, you paid someone to leave milk out for overnight on purpose so that you bought it for more money. It's kind of like that kind of like mindset thing.
And how did you guys get started, and how long have you been around for?
So, I guess Secret Meat Club officially got started after I interned in South Carolina under Craig Deal, who he was a chef in Charleston, and he had a business called Artisan Meat Share, AMS, and that actually became part of their restaurant offerings. In the 2008 recession, he brought in whole pigs so they can use the pork belly and pork chops on the menu, and then decided, like, how can we value add the rest of this stuff, and that's where that whole vision for them started. And so when I found him, I was able to finally convince him to let me come down and volunteer some hours. So yeah, when I got back from that, it turned into like, well, that was really exciting and interesting, and how do I continue pursuing that? So that's where the Secret Meat Club, in terms of my Instagram handle and stuff, came from, and that became part of where I was working with Duchess and further on that, to continue to try to showcase some of the back of the house scenes. We've been around we started Secret Meat Club as a subscription service in 2016, as a way to try to do some test batches for restaurants and build up a little bit of wholesale, and in conjunction with that, have the test batches go somewhere instead of having it waste, or having let's say the restaurant wants like this type of bratwurst or this type of ham, and then we do 3 different versions and they all fit the same description, and they go, we really like this one more, but is there a way you could put more garlic or pepper or something like that? And so then that way we had a way to utilize basically like unusable products. And by unusable, I mean the restaurant didn't want us to use it, even though it's not inferior, it's different. We're like, okay. So that was really the main drive, was to try to get some feedback, test drive products, and try to mitigate waste. Because for us to do a batch of something takes a lot of energy in terms of spicing, and we do a pretty substantial paperwork trail as well for every batch and every animal that comes down the stairs here. So we wanted to make the most out of that.
And the nice thing, again, with the diversity of products and the level of knowledge that you guys have within this space, within your team, is you are doing high level, next level, intricate things for the restaurant industry, but you're also providing a really good, accessible experience for a customer who isn't in the industry to come down, and instead of going to a big box store, coming down and getting something locally made by experts that's different and has a whole different flavor profile in a positive way, rather than just your backpack cured meat at a grocery store.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of variables that go into it that a lot of people don't take into consideration, or that they're not aware that that's a variable that can be changed. So that's where it comes in really exciting when working and doing custom production or development for a wholesale client, because then, like I said earlier, even if it's not exactly what they want and we can make some steps to get a little closer to what they want, it's still going to be something, in our case, for for selling to the general public, that it's going to be, again, like 2 or 3 steps removed in terms of like the generic variables being met.
And the nice thing too for people who may not know a lot about Meuwlys is within the facility and the deli and the store, there is a diverse array of products, whether it's preserves locally made, whether it's the meat being cured in the counter or the freezers, or again, cheese being made in-house. You guys really do offer a full service experience in a boutique kind of way without the pretentiousness usually associated with something being artisanal or boutique.
Right, yeah, we wanted to take down that stigma, and we wanted to also try to help, like I said earlier, educate people and like not gatekeep information, and like help people understand why it's different. And again, like you were saying with the other local businesses and stuff, we try to incorporate ourselves in a way to support the other people that we believe in their businesses as well. Yeah, that's a big part of what we're trying to achieve.
It's really important to build that community and to take the steps to support everybody else in it, because again, I think that's just cyclical, that when you're supporting other people, they're supporting you, and it's just really important, I think, for people within the local community to work together. But now that we've kind of gone over what Meuwlys is and who you are and a little bit of the background, I'll have you show me some of the facility.
Yeah, that sounds great. This is the aging room. So it actually is this whole wall. It's 12 feet by 24 feet. And that's where basically the environment's controlled with temperature and humidity to let all our products slowly dry and ripen. This is our fermenting cabinet, which is literally a bread proofer. It's really neat about this proofer specifically is that it's one of the only ones I could find to go down to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And 2, the water for the humidity is actually, what's the word? Atomized. So it's actually not a hot plate with a pan of water, it's actually spraying water into the air.
And why is 70 degrees so important?
So 70 degrees, we normally ferment at 74, which is under 24 degrees Celsius. So the amount of degrees temperature over 15.6, you have a certain amount of hours for it to heat critical limit of 5.3 pH or lower. And that's for Staphylococcus aureus. So you don't get food poisoning, basically. And the warmer the temperature, the ratio between them gets smaller and smaller. So if you go like, we ferment under 24, so we have 78.9 hours, which is like 3.5 days. If we were to ferment at 27, it's like 40 hours. So then it's 2 days. Or if we ferment under 22, I think it's like 108 hours. I have the chart on my paperwork, but we always try to stay under the 24. But sometimes we do a secondary ferment after it's hit critical limit of under 5.3. Where we'll raise the temperature to get different bacterial growth, mostly staph species, to get a little bit better stability in color and more volatiles and more enzymatic activity for flavor and aromatics, yeah. So if we tried to ferment at 27 in the first place, it would be a little bit more free-for-all in terms of level playing field for everything to grow, whereas we're fermenting cooler, it's a little bit cleaner lactic flavor profile, a little more of the sour is a little bit more clean flavor, and then we raise it up once everything's stabilized to get the secondary fermentation.
So yeah, just really, really important for creating that flavor profile and that culture within the meat and the sausage that you're trying to obtain.
Yeah. And that's basically what preserves it. I mean, it's the salt content that starts with the first hurdle. It's your time management is one of the second hurdles. Your pH is the critical limit as well for that another hurdle. And once you hit all these critical limits, you're showing in different avenues food safety in each of them to move forward to be even more stable and more safe. And that's essentially what makes it safe to consume once it's been dried. Because then once everything is kind of bound up with salt and acid, then we remove the water and basically chokes out pathogens. So.
And I mean, for me, one of the big things of wanting more people to know what you're doing is exactly what you just described. The level of knowledge that you guys have and the level of detail that you and your team have in every detail that you just described. There's not many people in Alberta, let alone Canada, with the knowledge and expertise that you guys have here to obtain the products that you're trying to obtain. And I mean, Edmonton and Alberta, like, we're really, really lucky to have somebody with your expertise.
Thanks. This is a raw cooler, so anything that's in process So all the dry cured products, the pigs are hanging there until cut day. What else? We did some dry aging in here. The temperature's really stable around 2 degrees. And because there's so much open meat in there, the humidity is really high. So it actually works exceptionally well for dry aging stuff, because you don't want to be too wet and you don't want it to be too dry because of yield. And also, the humidity and temperature also affect the relationship of salt penetration and the curing cycle. So we're around 90% humidity in there. 87 would be a little more ideal, but it doesn't really matter that much. So it's not wet and it's not dry, and the temperature range, ideally it would be about 4, but for all our raw product in there, we want to keep it a little cooler than that.
Well, and one of the interesting things that you've shown me in here that maybe not a lot of people know about is you guys are dry aging pork.
Yeah.
So for Smoky Bear, you guys are doing a bone-in belly dry age, which if you haven't tried it, for anybody who hasn't, is phenomenal. But not a lot of people, especially in Alberta, know you can dry age beef, but not a lot of people know that you can do other meats, whether it's fish or pork. So it's really cool to see that you guys are playing with that as well.
Yeah, especially there's people in Australia, and I think there's a couple in New Zealand I've seen now too, where they're doing dry aged whole fish, and they build a whole business on dry aging fish and tuna, even like ones that are histamine producers. And you're like, what? That's so cool. Like, right?
Again, that's why I love the facility and what you guys are doing. There's so many different levels, so many different aspects, and so many different layers to what you guys are doing, the level of knowledge that's in the facility, what you guys are putting out. That, again, people in Alberta, people in Canada, people in Edmonton don't know the level of expertise, the differentiation of products that you guys are doing, and just how lucky we are to have a facility like this doing what you guys are doing.
Yeah, I'm fortunate enough to have the people around me working with me too. Like, everyone that works here has the same common goal, and all of us have like really different wells of depth of information in different areas. Like you were saying, cheese, we have a cheesemaker here, Addie, and we're, like even the cultural history of like when things start getting smoked as you start getting into Northern Europe, versus that it's exactly inversely proportionate as having cheeses that are lower salt and go into bloomy rind. So all the Mediterranean cheese is too warm and too humid, so they're all heavily salted. And it's actually really cool, like such charged conversations about like proteins and fat and like enzymatic breakdown and like digestibility or like lactose intolerant stuff, and like it's fantastic. Like such charged conversations.
Well, and that's why it's so interesting, is everybody just thinks you can go to a grocery store and get something, and a lot of that stuff is pumped full of chemicals. But when you actually go back to what we were talking about, of the old world techniques that you guys are using, these techniques have been around for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
But we've foregone them for easier techniques and chemicals and mass production rather than quality, flavor, and taste, which is huge. There's not a lot of people doing that anymore.
Yeah, and what you're saying, chemicals, like, I always find it funny when people have like no preservatives. I'm like, salt's a preservative? I'm like, oh, well, I mean, no artificial preservatives. And I was like, they're all natural. Unfortunately, a lot of it actually isn't necessarily for, they're usually like curing aids or something to extend shelf life, or so it can be frozen for a year and not deteriorate in quality. Or like, for example, like if you have a cake with icing and a cookie crust, if they have different amounts of water, that's okay, but they have to be bound to be all even. Otherwise, the water will migrate to the cookie and make it soft, or it'll migrate to the icing and make it runny. And so what they have to do, I've worked federally before where that is literally someone's job, where you have to take water activity and you have to take pH and you have to take entropy and you have to take, I guess, basically trying to chemically bind everything so that they don't bleed into each other. So that's where like the majority of like additives come from. It's usually for shelf life. It's not actually for like making it safer or preserving it. It's actually to like prevent oxidation or prevent even ice crystals forming, or use 2 or 3 different types of sugar, because if it's one type of sugar and it crystallizes, then it'll seed all of it. And if you have more than 2 types of sugar, then the crystals are different shapes, so they actually don't mesh and they don't crystallize. So just a ton of that stuff goes into that type of product, and that's a whole different level of thinking. and I really appreciate that stuff. But I also am a person that thinks that everything should have a shelf life. Everything should slowly change. I mean, fermented and cured meats and hams and stuff is controlled decay. That's basically what it is. Same with cheese.
Well, and
That's fantastic.
Nothing lasts forever. Nothing's supposed to.
Yeah, right?
So when you guys get the whole animals in,
Yeah.
and you bring them down here and they go into the raw cooler, what are the next steps from taking that whole animal and producing it and breaking it down to getting it in to the aging room? And once it's all cut down, broken down into its groups, what are the next steps for turning it into a product?
Well, it depends on what the product is. We have such a wide gamut of production. So whether it's dry cured and cooked, or dry cured and smoked, or dry cured, smoked and dried in the aging room, or dry cured and then dried in the aging room, or dry cured, ground, fermented, smoked, cooked, or dry cured, fermented, ground, and aged. There's all those different steps are completely independent of each other. So, like I said, we make so many different types of products, so it depends on what type of product. So, if it's a ground product, we'd be using our grinder, and we usually grind everything coarse first. All our salami is completely boned out yield, no connective tissue, no sinew, no fascia, and then added only the hardest back fat back at 20%. Because then we have a known ingoing fat content. Each piece gets made the same size by weight, so we have a known finished weight that we're yielding. So in that way, it gives us a little more flexibility on how and when to pull a batch of salami. Now, if it's something like bratwurst or something like that, we usually just use the general trim, which is around 20% fat, but still technically between like the lean and regular limits for what was considered ground beef, lean and regular when I worked plant doing ground beef samples.
And then once it's out, once it's ground, then it gets cased?
Yeah, so once it gets ground, then we mix it with the spices, which is what this mixer is for, which is, it's actually, it's getting the vacuum fixed. So right now we're using the mixer grinder as well, which actually is pretty fortunate because we got a European style throat on it. So it actually has a kidney plate, a knife, a coarse plate, a knife, and then the final grind. So that way, instead of incrementally, or instead of like crushing it with the auger in the worm, in the screw, we're incrementally cutting the pieces smaller. So we actually end up with a much better texture and also a higher yield in cooked products. It's really neat. And then after that, we end up with the stuffer. So the lid on the hopper comes down. There is a rotary vane that goes inside. And basically it doses in cc's. So you would set it to like 145, and it would be 145 cc's, which roughly correlates to the weight. If it's something with a higher fat, it will be off. Or if it's something that's like a finer emulsion, like hot dogs or mortadella, or if it's something that is like stiffer, like a lot of our beef products, they generally have a little more soluble protein, so they actually end up being a tighter mix. That cc's amount will technically be a little bit different from the amount of back pressure that the machine actually has while dosing. So it's not exact for weight, but it is for cc's.
Interesting, okay.
Yeah, and with the linker on the front, we get automatic twisting in between. So
That's nice.
it's really nice, except for it's funny, because if you're not doing over 50 kilos of the batch, it's not worth using the machines. So when we do projects for people that are like a 20 kilo batch or like 35 kilos, we use all the hand equipment that I started with in my little 170 square foot kitchen, because it takes an hour to stuff, but then 10 minutes to clean. This takes 10 minutes to stuff and an hour to clean. So
Finding that balance.
yeah, so for us, that's usually our guide for like, are we using the big boy toys, or are we doing the hand crank and doing it all manual?
Yep. So for me, this is one of the most important aspects about what you guys are doing here. Amongst everything else we've talked about today, you just don't see a lot of this going on anymore. And this goes back to the old world preservation. Might be weird for some people because, well, the meat's moldy, but you'll be able to explain that in a lot more detail. But for me, this is looking behind the curtain and showing people the actual meat and potatoes of kind of what you guys are doing and why you're doing it and why it's so important.
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying earlier about the fermentation, with the known fermentation, and we know what the molds are. I do have a microscope, and we have actually identified them. But they are penicillin species. We know that they're growing on meat. We know that they're eating lactic acid. They are producing enzymes that help break down and tenderize and help make flavor profile, as well as aromatics, like I mentioned earlier. They also have a really important job of, they breathe oxygen, so they're actually stopping the meat from oxidizing as well. And because they blanket coat like this, it's not so much a problem in here, but they help protect it from photo-oxidation as well. So they actually play quite an important role. They also, they yield like a nice mellow, like mushroomy, earthy flavor, aromatics too as well for the nose. And yeah, they actually are a really important part of the ripening process that I think a lot of people have never seen something like this moldy before. They can range from like a white, a little bit of a gray, so we got some gray on here. We got some green, there's some more gray. Sometimes it even goes black. This is actually juniper, that's what you're seeing there. But yeah, it's really cool because they even change colors through their life cycle. And we actually had an inspector come through here once and was like, well, all the mold's green, it's supposed to be white, isn't it? And I was like, well, yeah, that's the commercial starter culture that's been genetically modified to not go to spore. So the green, what you're seeing is actually UV protection for the mold to be able to go to spore and to procreate. So this is actually its natural form, whereas the commercial stuff that's completely white is not natural. And actually it's actually been shown in several studies that I've read that the commercial mold cultures, because they're grown without competition, in real life practical use, they actually produce more toxins more often than the naturally occurring molds.
And how would these how would they be different than like a yeast in a sourdough or fermentation in beer when it is a substructure of decomposition through fermentation on those things? What creates the difference between all these different aspects?
These actually do have yeast as well. When we brush them, we brush all the powdery spores off. Like, I don't know if you can see how, let's find a puffy one. Like, it's a little bit dusty. So we actually will brush these off before they get packaged. And you can actually sometimes see texture from the yeast. So they'll actually make like tiny little bumps and stuff, especially on the surface of the salami casings. Less so the whole muscle, but. And I think each one of those types of fermentations that you listed they're not single strain fermentations, or originally they weren't. So same thing to sourdough, you have yeast, you have bacteria. You know, when you change the temperature, then you're gonna start getting like acetone smells and vinegar and stuff. Like if you take them and hold them in the fridge, like to slow down a starter, then you're changing the dynamics of the population. Same thing too with beer originally. They're like spontaneously lactic and yeast to make them alcoholic. These are the kind of the same thing where it's more mixed media, and that's like the opposite of like the mainstream where the starter cultures usually take one species or a combination of two species and blanket everything with that because that's what they took off of something like this. Whereas it's more of like a community of different microorganisms supporting each other, and we get to reap the benefits of it.
And once you take the product from the outside area that we went through, and it comes in here, explain what's going on in the process and the change from a fresh casing to fermented end product, the life cycle of from outside the aging room into here, out to the customer.
All right. Well, it's funny because we've had a few people reach out and say like, we want to come and like see how the salami is made and stuff. And I was like, okay, do you want to be a part of the actual like cutting and then later in the week the mixing, grinding, and production of it? Or do you want to actually see like the steps through the ripening and the fermentation, which is like the following week? Or do you want to see its life cycle, which is basically, depending on the format, between 3 and 10-ish weeks or so, depending on the caliber of the casing. And they're like, yeah, I just want to come and see you grind it, mix it. I'm like, well, it's exactly the same as fresh sausage in the beginning. And it's the steps that we take to get it to be this product that are more important than the first part. No, there is, like I was saying earlier about the fat content in our salami. So we do 20% because that gives us a known expected yield. So then we know when each piece is done, because they're all stuffed relatively pretty close. Like I was saying, in cc's, it's pretty close to, they're about within 55 grams of each other usually. So it's a pretty small margin of error there. So if we increase the fat content, then the water from the lean muscle has more turns to get around the fat to go from the center to the outside and from the outside to evaporation. So that will slow down your drying. If we do a finer grind, and then there's even more turns. So then we have things that you can play with that level of maturation by either grinding finer or adding more fat, or the opposite, where you make it leaner and you have coarser grind. And that's only the first step, because then now you have to try to manage your fermentation, which is basically managing the amount of available carbohydrates for fermentation. So we've actually found that the stuff that have like really high paprika levels, they actually ferment about 0.3 pH lower because they're fermenting the paprika as well. So in that respect, we were able to remove some of the sugar. We use literally sucrose, which is also not common. Most of the production uses dextrose, which is one of the most simple sugars as glucose, right? But bacteria actually like a little bit of pressure. They like a little bit of competition. And so using the sucrose, there's some species that don't like to ferment that, but there's a lot that really enjoy that. So we were able to buffer the sucrose in that recipe for the amount of paprika or pepper paste in other recipes, because those spices also went to the fermentation. So our target is to try to be between 5.1 and 5.2 at the finish of the fermentation. Because what we want to do is we want to maintain some of the staphylococcal species that are important for flavor and color development. I was mentioning earlier about the proofer. They start to slow down around 5.3 pH, and they almost don't exist or don't continue to grow or become active anymore lower than 5. So we want to try to keep them in that realm, because then we can get even more activity out of them. And then on top of that, then you put it into a different size casing or a different breed of animal casing. Or so like if we are doing some into like bungs or something, because they're a thicker wall casing with micro layers of fascia and fats, it actually also slows down the drying, and you get even more flavor development that way, and usually also from staph species. I should mention that the 5.3 limit that exists, that we are forced to adhere to by the food handling laws, it doesn't exist in Europe. It's not the same thing. For fermented meats in Europe, they try to drop water activity, not try to get it sour. So a lot of the fermenting programs in North America are high humidity, usually high temperature, so they're faster turnaround, and then they try to dry them. But they ferment them lower as well to about 4.8, 4.7, so you don't get the same level of maturation from the bacteria, but you get more acid flavor profile and faster drying. So that's all like just for commercial production. That's a lot where that comes from. Whereas the European method, which is the way we do it, is we bring up the temperature with high humidity, and then once the internal temperature of the sausage is a few degrees cooler than the actual room, then we'll actually start doing active air exchanges as fast as the product will allow moisture to come out. Originally, there would be like a day and a night cycle where the nights would be cool and damp to soften the outside, and then the daytime would be dry and warm. So then you'd dry it out too much, and then you'd cool it off and constrict it with the temperature. And that pumping action would help make it more efficiently drying. And so originally, this whole process for salami making is to drop water content as fast as possible. And the fermentation is actually more of the staph species, less so the focus on lactic species. It's actually really cool because even the stuff for export, they have to hit our laws to be able to export to us. So then they will ferment down to 5.3, check that box, and then they'll let the mold ripen it, and the mold actually consumes the lactic acid, so it'll actually revert the meat back up to like 5.6, 5.7.
So when you're talking about different casings, whether it's collagen or bungs, does it have how does that affect the flavor profile? Kind of like a whiskey or a bourbon within the barrel, with that night and day cycle of the breathability of the spirits going into the barrel and coming back in and contracting in and out, in and out. That charred barrel is providing a lot of flavor and coloring to that spirit. Is something similar happening, or have you noticed that happening through the different types of casings that you guys are using, or do they not add much flavor?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. The collagen casings, because they're layered collagen as a single wall, they tend to not give too much resistance to moisture leaving. So like when we do regular hog casings, they're a little bit thicker. They have a little bit more fat than the collagen, but they also aren't the same as the bigger, thick casings. And the interesting part too about the thicker casings, especially with how they smell, and there's a lot of people put off by that, but those sulfur compounds get fermented too with the staph species, also to create more flavor, more aromatics. So yeah, the different casing, although the dimensions and the permeability of the casing do add to the flavor profile, so does actually the material the casing is made out of, in terms of like the stinkier the casing, the more flavorful the sausage.
Yeah, that's really cool.
It's actually so fascinating where almost all the old like PDI, DOP, AOC, all those like stamps of like designation from a place, almost all of those recipes are like a specific pig to a specific size or age on a specific diet, because those are the most important things for flavor. And then certain kernel size of grain and a certain amount of casing diameter or casing type. And almost all of them are just salt, pepper, a splash of wine, sometimes salt and garlic, sometimes salt, garlic wine. But all of them regionally come from a way of just preserving with very simple things, but it's about the terroir, it's about the animals, it's about showcasing that. It's actually been super interesting being here working with free range animals. When we were building out and we were already operating meat club and doing some wholesale, we were bringing in animals from different farms and getting different cut yields, and we were doing like different fat content yields. So like seeing how much trim we have to work with versus like how much salami we get versus how much fat or like less usable for like a spreadable salami, for example, versus the actual textures of the fat, because the diet changes the fat qualities so much. And actually it's only been this year that we've cut down 7 prosciuttos simultaneously to clean for Christmas, to see how much of a difference that makes pig to pig, even if they're only like 2 months old, like a 2 months difference in when we started curing them. So the diet from each season from the same farm likely would have been on the ground relatively in the same time frame, because I think we mostly deal with bear and flour, and they raise theirs for about 6 months from when they get them as weaners. So 2 months out of that 6 months is actually a substantial difference in their life. So it's really cool, because we've also had some Meuwlys that were, it's a special Hungarian breed that they're a lard breed, so they put fat on first. So they usually have to be 2 years or older for their bones to fill out and to fill out on meat. The ratio for lean to fat is still really, really low, so you have to be really intentional with how you use those types of animals. But we cut down one that was nearly 4 years old, and it was spectacular because of the age of the animal, because of the fat qualities, because of how old it was. It's more connective tissue, more exercise in the muscles. It just night and day. Like we had one ham that was from our normal supplier that we aged to about 3 years, and like almost like the way wine goes, where you could start to taste its flavor starting to like plateau. Like we could tell we were just at that age of plateauing. That's why we cleaned 7. They're like, okay, we need to sell these, because like you can tell like they're not going to get better from now on, because you can already feel the trajectory plateauing, because we have cut them at 18 months, we have cut them at 24, and this was the first time we were pushing past that. I mean, circumstantially, we were pushing past that.
And what creates that plateau? Because taking something from like a Berkshire or a more standardized breed of pig and then going to something like a Meuwlys with way more fat content,
yeah.
Even in salamis for that matter, how does the variable fat content compared to protein content affect the end product through the fermentation and decomposition and flavor development of each product?
To liken it to cheese, when you have something that's really low water content, like Parmesan, you can age it way longer than something that's higher content of water, which is like a brie. So it because of the way the aging potential of the actual fat is shortened because of the age of the animals, and also the diet, as I was saying. So we found that we had actually another farm that we dealt with. They were feeding their animals a commodity ration of corn and soy, and like we aged the prosciutto a full year, and then we we decided to clean it up for a wholesale customer that wanted a younger ham, and the fat almost tasted like buttered popcorn, like from a movie theater. And I was like, whoa, this is so weird. Like, that's how much of a difference, and it was so dense and hard. Like, that one should have been one that should have aged longer, or potentially could have because of the fat qualities. But because these are all not cooked, these are all raw meat, they're still enzymatically active as well. So we actually had some spots on the face of that ham that were getting like smudgy, almost like the texture of your arm, like loose skin. And that's actually just enzymatic breakdown. So we were able to trim that off. The ham's completely fine, but it is definitely a sign that it can't age very long. Like, it definitely will all just slowly break down and disintegrate.
Yeah, I mean, it is decomposition, but through that you're getting the molecular functionality of flavor, which is really cool. I mean, you don't see that whether, again, it's the mold like we were talking about or the fermentation. There's so many aspects of the process, which is, again, what is so impressive with what you and your team are doing, is the level of knowledge, the ability to, within reasonable means, because it is nature, control those substrates and produce a product that's phenomenal. It's just really impressive. I mean, again, there's not a lot of people taking the time to do the process as it was done for so long, because everybody just likes chemicals nowadays.
Yeah, and exactly, that's what I was saying, that having the regularity of the ingoing product of the animals is literally how they control those designated stamps, because the process is important, but the actual main ingredients are part of the process. So it's just like you can't grow a bunch of trees with branches on the exact same spots. Like, you can try your best and prune them and stuff like that, but you're still gonna have to like judge every animal and if it's stressed at slaughter, it'll have a different pH, or it won't go low enough pH, or you'll have too much residual glucose, or then you have to consider how else gonna change your fermentation if it's gonna be actually, the meat itself has energy in it. So even just taking the meat with no sugar, it's still gonna ferment. Actually, really cool, horse meat has so much glucose that you don't have to add sugar because it's so sweet already. Yeah, really interesting.
And is there a way to test those balances and levels before you start the process, or you don't really know until you're well into it?
Yeah, you can. One would be with definitely having a relationship with your supplier, obviously. But we can also take pH, and then we get a little better idea of what we should or should not use sometimes the products for. There's been instances where it was a cold snap, and then the animals were trying to like stay warm, and they weren't going out to eat, and so then they were consuming their own fat. So then when the animals showed up here, there was less fat on the animals, and it was softer because they were actively consuming, like using it for fuel, like energy. So then we had to change gears, and we couldn't use that fat for salami because it was too soft, because it was already starting to break down, or for lack of a better word, break down. But that's the cool part too, is this is, like I was saying earlier about bioavailability of minerals and vitamins and nutrition, like the whole prosciutto, the whole ripening of either whole muscle or salami, you're actually also breaking down your protein into amino acids, and they're more available for you and I to absorb. Same thing too with free fatty acids as well. So like that's where you get like the Iberico ham that's like so oily and so luscious. Like that's actually like a supplement, for lack of a better word. Like that's what food used to be, and it's like very difficult to like find sources of that type of foods here now, and that's another part of why I think what we're doing is so important.
Yeah, definitely.
It's really cool. And to speak to using free range animals, they also because they spend all their time outside, free range, or the majority of it, per tablespoon of lard from a free-range animal can have up to 1,000 international units of vitamin D in it. Whereas the animals that are raised indoors don't have the same nutritional values either. So, and then again to that, every pig's different. So you're like...
Well, and that's what is so impressive, again, with what you guys are doing, is the ability with all the variables, the mold, the amino acids, the product itself from the animal, to be able to turn out a consistent product with all those variables is just incredible.
Yeah, that's the hard part. I mean, I've seen people say like, oh, it's just meat and salt and time, patience. And you're like, yeah, if you want to make something once, but if you want to make it recurring, actually we've even found making the same product between the winter and the summer tasting different. We ended up, like I was saying earlier about, we had a really big contract when we first opened that we had to bring in 1,800 kilos. So that 1,800 kilos amounted in our supplier's freezer over the course of a couple seasons. So when we made the same thing, the same recipe, in the same day from different bags of trim, it literally tasted different.
Yeah.
It was like super cool.
The consistency is, I mean, again, to be able to build a business around old world techniques and hit that consistency is really, really impressive. But I think one thing for me that's really important for people to know and to see is to see something that might be intimidating and scary with all the mold in it, and seeing the process that goes from taking it to something that might be intimidating and deter people to putting it out on the counter and seeing the different process and seeing what happens from this stage to the stage out on the counter for sale and marketability of it all.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
have you show us and walk us through the next steps of taking this to getting it out there.
So yeah, as you saw there with a little bit of the mold dusting there, we actually use a vegetable brush, like a vegetable scrubbing brush, and we just take off the actual spores so they're not puffy, and the customer, whichever is wholesale or front of house, they don't actually need to deal with that dusty mold part. And then it gets vacuum sealed like this, and that will have it preserved without continuing to dry. And then we roll them in this white paper, and then they get labeled and identified as such with ingredients. And then there was a couple in there, I don't know if we got any shots, but there were some bigger format ones. And they're usually the same flavors, and like I was saying, we end up, they take longer to dry, and we end up with a little bit different yield than the smaller ones, but then we sell those as packs as well as whole pieces. So that's kind of like the full spectrum of like so one time we were receiving pigs, and there's people standing at the till, and there's like 2 or 3 like 30 to 40-year-old men just, and they're like, what's that for? And this lady behind them in line, who's definitely like a senior, was like, that's what you're holding. It was quite adorable, but it's like, yeah, that's the huge disconnect with food that people, they just, like it doesn't, seeing that doesn't mean this. Like, but that's what this is.
It's the disassociation that we've had through society, which is unfortunate, makes sense, but unfortunate that people have lost touch of where their products actually come from. Again, I think that's why it's so important to showcase what you guys are doing, is the start to finish whole animal butchery products, the old world preservation, which is phenomenal. Again, not a lot of people are doing it. And I think it's something that locally Edmonton needs to experience and see. And that being said, for somebody who hasn't been here before, or somebody who even has been here before, what type of experience are you guys trying to curate and provide somebody when they do walk through that door and come to this counter? What do you want them to see? What do you want them to appreciate? And what do you want them to know about what you guys are doing?
Well, since we opened, we've been pretty transparent about wanting people to ask more questions, because that gives us opportunity to teach or coach, instruct, lead without being overbearing. So we want people to ask us questions. We want to explain. We want to share what we're doing here. We want to give people tours when people come in and they're interested. Like, yeah, like, ask more questions, be curious.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's important in any aspect of food, especially what you guys are doing. And I mean, I think that's what Andrew and I are trying to accomplish through this type of a program, is just to help educate people and show people what they may not know, but also, again, just show, like, food is food. It should be accessible.
Food. Exactly.
You got to ask questions. You have to be curious about where your things are coming from and the level of detail of people doing important things that you might not know. And I think it's really important for people to come and experience that here, whether they're looking for a local product, dry good, or again, like looking for some cheese that Addie's making, or any of the cured meats too that you guys are doing. I mean, the coolers are stocked and the refrigerators are stocked with ample products. Again, like you were saying before, whether it's pepperoni, hot dogs, or really interesting, unique salamis that, again, you're not going to find anywhere else. You're not going to find at Safeway. You're not going to find at the Italian Center. One, because they're just not made the same. And two, the recipes and things that you guys are putting together are so unique and original to what you're doing that it is honestly a privilege for Edmonton and Alberta to have purveyors and manufacturers like you guys who do take so much care in what you're doing.
Thank you so much for the kind words. I mean, like exactly like you said, we have we have regular approachable things like hot dogs, fennel salami, that's pretty easy. But then we have like this juniper salami that's made with ground bay leaf and red wine. The minis we were in there that were hanging, that we were shooting, those ones are black cardamom, green cardamom, a little bit of cocoa powder, and liver. So ideally it's going to be smoky, earthy, a little bit of floral from the green, and the cocoa alkalineness is going to round out the liver to be like important but not overbearing. It's about 15% liver. So that's going to be something like you can't go get that. That's like, that's.
Even, I mean, one of the first times that we connected too, I think you gave me, which was like a joke challenge for you, was like a salami with jelly beans in it, because you were being challenged by somebody that like, yeah, no, you can make a salami from anything. And again, that's just a testament of not like, oh, look, we can do this, it's fun, it's like gimmicky. It's a fact of like, no, I know my product and everything behind the product so well and to such a level of detail that I can execute something like that because I actually know how to execute something like that. Which again, where else are you going to find that in the province, let alone Canada? It's really genuinely impressive.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming by today.
Yeah, thanks for the time and thanks for sharing all of this with everybody. And it's really important for me to help showcase what you guys are doing, because being in the industry, I had an idea, but until I actually came here and saw what you guys are doing and the level of magnitude and the level of intellect and knowledge that you guys have under this umbrella for your entire team, it's just second to none. It's super impressive, and I think more people need to know what you guys are doing, why you're doing it, and now have a little bit of insight into how they're doing it. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And if you ever want to talk some more, I probably left a lot out. Come back again.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank Will from Meuwlys for his time and for sharing his knowledge and passion. Thanks for watching. See you next time on Friends of the Pit.